This book is actually not published in hard form. It's only published in e-form. And MJ published it on his birthday last November as a birthday present to himself. If you are interested, it can be got if you can download a free Kindle app to any computer, and you can read the whole thing yourself. It is, hello Blythe, it is by my estimation a 10-hour live read, so I won't be reading all 10 hours of it. I'm only brownies. Did you say brownies? I'm only going to do 5 hours of it. So if you want to find out all the other things that that happen in the course of the book, you can buy it for an incredibly small amount of money and read it on your computer. But to find out more about MJ and about the book, click on the panel under the chicken to my left. And with that, I think we're going to go ahead and start, and I'm going to, Shannon, hope that you keep an eye out for MJ, who I left parked right behind the back row of seats there. And I hope he remembers. So, on with, we're actually going to start with a prologue. In the prologue, he does some quick introductions. I have chickens. I know how to use them. He does some quick introductions to some of the key characters in the story. And so we'll start off with the prologue and meeting some of those characters. First we have Brishee. The dust seemed to levitate over the road, and it was well over Brishee's head. It floated and clung. Most of her face was covered by a handkerchief. Unfortunately for them, the goat she was driving had no such advantage. The beast's eyes watered and snot hung in strings from their noses. Brishee kept her flock in tight order. Her plan was going perfectly. By nightfall, she would be free. Cruith. Cruith was busy being arrested. It was something of a custom for her. Once a year she broke the law. Sometimes she got away with it more often. She was arrested. Simple arrest didn't deter Cruith. This year she had been caught after staging a raid on the king's chicken coop. She had actually managed to cook one scrawny old rooster before being apprehended. The cooked chicken went with her to jail, concealed beneath the folds of her skirt. She had sewn in an extra pocket or two on the inside of her dress and lined them with oilcloth. She wasn't about to spend another night in jail with no food. She also had dressed heavily in case she had to camp out. Prince Larry. Oh, Prince Larry's important. Prince Larry's a git. Prince Larry was being discreetly awakened by strange servants. He rolled over in bed and he realized he was not at home. My lady's lord arrives this afternoon, Your Highness. You really should tend to your, good morning, my lord. Did you rest well? Larry hadn't rested well for over a year. He was an overwrought pleasure seeker, faced with a big problem. Tradition and service and all that stuff were catching up to him. Not to mention several husbands who didn't appreciate the royal attention the prince gave their wives. Larry dressed in record time, which for him was damn fast, and dived into his coach minutes before the Earl came home and found a strangely wistful countess. Elsewhere, there was more agitation. And so we begin. The king had been pacing all day. He was in a virtual tizzy. He was convinced that his son would fail the test of kings. His son would be the first and only prince to fail this simple trial. All Larry had to do was work for a year and a day, just 366 days at some honest task, any honest task. It made for kinder rulers when they knew what it was like to live as a commoner. It was the tradition, indeed the law, that a king of Galaway must spend the time between his 21st birthday and his 22nd plus 1 day employed and living outside the castle. It was a test for which everyone in the kingdom were judges. Never had there been any reason for anyone to cry foul, and it was the nature of the test that citizens of Galaway could. The king had, in his own year and a day of service, worked as a hired hand on a poultry farm just outside the city. He had shoveled manure, gathered eggs, plucked chickens, and done all the other demeaning and necessary chores on the farm. He had done them without complaint, and he had done them well. He often looked back on those days with fondness, for although the work was hard, it was simple and without responsibility, except for the farmer and the chickens. He still kept a few hens and a couple of roosters. Good King Willy didn't know it, but he was down to one rooster. Cruith had the other. The scratching and pecking of the fowl in the courtyard soothed his nerves, and he enjoyed the fresh eggs. The wild squawks and fluttering of his flock now took him to the window. His son's coach clattered into the courtyard as if pursued. The driver of the coach, Elfane, Prince Larry's personal servant, wore the look of one ordered to do something of which he didn't approve. Part of the king's mind noted that there didn't seem to be as many chickens as there should have been. The thought was lost, however, when Prince Larry stumbled out of the carriage and made his way wearily into the castle proper. John, the king's manservant, snorted from where he stood at another window. "Well, Willy, looks like he's been at it again. See there? He's got his doublet on backwards." John was one of the few people in the world who could talk to the king in this fashion. John had been the king's personal servant since the king had finished his year and a day of labor. The king and John had worked together as equals on the chicken farm, and John had never lost the habit of addressing the king by his first name, although he was discreet in mixed company. And King Willy, for his part, had never lost the habit of having a friend who was both wise and honest. "I tell you, Willy, you've got a real problem with that boy. Tomorrow he turns 21, and he must perform his year and a day of service, and he's not fit to shine sandals in the market. There's not a merchant or a craftsman in the kingdom who wants to be saddled with that lout for a year. Your subjects continue to speculate on what possible labor he could do." "What do they think he could do?" asked the king, hoping for an idea. I read. "Well, with all respect, sire," John only got formal when he knew he was on thin ice, "they think his only talents lie in the area of, well, pleasing the ladies. And if someone were to open a 4-women-only brothel, he could serve there as well, you know." The king started to get angry, and then he sighed. There was nothing wrong with the peasant's assessment of his son's abilities. Larry's only area of interest or talent seemed to lie in bed. "Damn," thought Willy. "You give them everything, and all they return is trouble. Inform the prince that he is to see me at once, and then send Elfane to me." The king seldom spoke to John in such a way. John was just about to slip quietly away when the king added, "And come back yourself, John, with some lunch. I need your help to solve this problem." John took a chance and patted the king's shoulder. "We'll work it out, Will. There's got to be something the boy can do. I'll see to Elfane and to lunch. Oh, and I'll have the throne moved to the king's hall." "Move the throne? Why?" "The king's hall was only used for formal events. Tomorrow is Beggar's Day." "Damn, I'd forgotten that Larry was born on Beggar's Day. Very well, you and Elfane meet me in the king's hall. If it's not one thing, it's another. Beggar's Day on top of the rest of it. Sometimes I wish we had stayed on the chicken farm, John." "It was indeed simpler, sire." John backed away quietly out of the room. The king went back to the window and, moved by some agrarian instinct, counted his chickens, and counted again. And then he realized who was missing. Charlie, a rooster who was 10 years old and a personal friend of the king. "Oh, heads will roll," Willy intoned to himself. His body gave a jerk as he wondered where Charlie's head was at the moment, and if it was within proximity of the rest of his body. And of course it was. Charlie's head was in one pocket, and most of his body was in another. Cruith had a lot of pockets. Cruith embodied the phrase, "tough old bird." King Willy was often referred to in the same manner, not in his presence, of course. And as Cruith would shortly find out, Charlie the rooster was well on the tough side himself. Brishee studied the market square carefully and maneuvered her master's goats as close to the center of the bustling hubbub as possible. She could see her master haggling with the meat merchant. He was pointing to this goat and that goat, no doubt adding pounds and dropping years as he described their wondrous and goatly qualities. Thule the butcher shook his head and countered with scowls and comments designed to deflate the asking price. Brishee might as well have been invisible at this point, as all the two haggling men could see were goats, and that was just fine by Brishee. At 18, she knew more about survival than most of the king's marines. She was only 10 when her parents and the rest of their traveling troop of plague-givers had died of some strange flu and left her sitting at a dismal camp by an infected river. Oh. Hello, Kata. Good to see you. Oh, good. Did Arletta got her voice? Yeah, that's good. Yes. And since the first tinker had found her, she had been traded and sold a total of 7 times. She had inherited enough of her parents' talent to hide the fact that she was both beautiful and intelligent. She appeared misshapen and filthy. She was slow to respond and could drool on cue. Oh, that's useful. This saved her from some labors and the attentions of lewd masters at secluded campsites. Her seemingly dull eyes slid slowly over the scene once more. Her master and the butcher were engaged in an intense bit of haggling over a milk goat that Brishee knew, for a fact, was about to dry up and could produce no more kids. As Brishee went after a straying billy, she slyly slid a large firecracker from beneath her rags once. During a brief tenure as an Oriental caravan slave, she had seen the effects of a combustible such as this. Then one day, her current master, a particularly toothless and vulgar man, had walked out of the Mongol's tent, and Brishee knew that she had been sold again, no doubt at a profit. Somehow, as she was being led out of the camp with her wrists tied in rawhide thongs, she managed to steal the pyrotechnic. She prayed the bomb would still work. Brishee had been carrying it for months, waiting for an opportunity. This marketplace, with its herd of goats, plus this unique firecracker, well, it was like a dream come true. Brishee took a deep breath and drooled a little to avoid attention. Then she moved the billy back into the herd and pretended to be interested in a stall connected to a tavern. Cooked chicken was being sold by a strikingly beautiful red-haired woman. Brishee hobbled up to the vendor, sniffed, grunted. It was near the brazier which warmed the fowl. The woman tending the chickens was the owner of the tavern, which was called, for some unknown reason, the Feathered Pig. It was brazier. It was brazier, not brazier. Sorry. The Feathered Pig. Yes. Here! You bag of filth, get away from my stall. I've got clean food here. Get away! Madeline waved a stick which Brishee stared at and then flinched away from. While she flinched, she deftly stuck the fuse of her firecracker into the coals of the fire and set it ablaze. She turned in time to cover the sputtering, well-worn fuse and limped back to her goats. Once among them, she let the bomb slide to the ground and sent it rolling into the herd with her toe. No one had seen what she had done. Behind her dull stare and stooped frame, she prayed frantically that her plan would work. It worked. Better than she could have hoped for. The firecracker sputtered, then spewed a shower of sparks before exploding with a roar that spooked every critter and human in the market. The goats panicked in 5 directions, trampling the chicken vendor's stall and setting several small fires. People screamed and ran in circles, vacillating between saving themselves and preserving their merchandise. The only common theme in the chaos was the smell of scorched wool and burned chickens. Hi, MJ. MJ's voice isn't working yet. In the confusion, Brishee quietly slipped behind a tinker's wagon, and when she emerged from the other end, she was standing tall. The ratty cloak that had marked her for a fool and a slave was over her arm. It would have taken close scrutiny by even her master to recognize her. While behind the wagon, Brishee had washed her face. Drops of water dotted her now uncovered hair, and she walked away from the melee and looked for a place to hide out. As she did so, she tucked a small tin cup into her pockets. She didn't like being a thief, but she liked even less being a slave, and the cup had been hung so carelessly on the side of the tinker's wagon. It was her experience that when a thing presented itself, it was best to grab it and wait for a chance to use it. This policy had paid off with the firecracker, after all, for she knew she'd find a use for her cup. Percy had the toughest of jobs because he had no job. Not really. Officially, he was the king's brother-in-law, but since the queen was dead, he could not really expect to have a lot of influence on the court. Good King Willy, more or less, accepted him as one accepts the color of a rug or the fact that a lamp works. In other words, he was a fixture, and treated as such. A fact which, applied to other more socially sensitive people, might have galled them a great deal. To be ignored was, for Percy, perfect. The country was quietly and efficiently run without him, and that left him time and energy to scheme. With the death of Queen Wanda, Percy's sister, came the first of his plans to take the throne. Since Willy had loved Wanda more than life itself, Percy thought that the king would follow her into the great beyond, and indeed it appeared that King Willy might die of a broken heart. For 2 years the king seldom stirred beyond the bleak north tower, and the mourning bunting was kept on the castle gates. Percy used the king's absence to buddy up to the then pre-adolescent prince. Percy became more and more the person that Larry looked up to and counted on for moral guidance. And given this fact, it was little wonder that Larry had no more morals than a snake and no more compassion than a mongoose. Then came that fateful spring when the king stepped forth from the North Tower with color in his cheeks and a smile on his lips. Willy had experienced a rebirth of sorts. One day, while gazing forlornly from his high window, he had seen the bright yellow bits of fluff pecking about in the courtyard below. His chickens, lovingly cared for by John, had managed to procreate. This simple and yet miraculous feat had taught him that life went on, and that one had a sacred duty to live it. That very day the black bunting had come down from the gates, and it was once more business as usual for good King Willy. For Percy, it was a severe setback. He had hoped that with the king's death he would be made regent over the minor Prince Larry and become the power behind the throne. Those hopes dashed. He had to rethink his plan. And for the life of him, he could not come up with another scheme, although he kept his influence over Larry more out of habit than for any defined purpose. Then, one evening, during an informal dinner, when the king and John, yes, the king actually ate with his manservant, got to reminiscing over brandy about the good old days on the chicken farm, Percy was struck with the glimmering of an idea. The test of kings. There must be some way to use the test to his advantage, but how? He pondered for months and months before the answer came to him. Prince Larry had gone to Percy seeking advice. The boy, then 14, had sneaked into the kitchen late at night and made off with a cherry pudding the king's chef had prepared especially for Willy's birthday. A pantry helper had been accused of the theft and was being punished by the chef. The poor pantry boy was serving a week in the dungeon for a crime that he did not commit. Larry wanted to know if he should confess the crime and free the innocent boy. Percy was about to advise him to do so when his mind gave a lurch and a grumble, and the gears started to grind toward a truly devious design. Percy told Larry, in no uncertain terms, that of course he shouldn't let his royal personage take the rap, any rap. After all, the pantry boy was a peasant, and peasants existed for the sole purpose of pleasing their betters. He told Larry that any other action would make him a dunce to his subjects, and that they would lose all respect for him. Then he sent Larry away and began to piece different scenarios together. Percy applied himself to the possibilities. If through moral ineptitude Prince Larry should fail the test of kings, then what? It had never happened before. Percy spent days in the royal library doing research. See, there's a library in here, Derry. The original charter for the test of kings decreed that failing the test would result in a pension and banishment. The boy would be sent away, never to become king or live in his native land. The charter called for all to despise the failed prince. From the current king to the lowliest peasant, all were to banish him. The book went on to say that the next of the royal line must be tested, and if no heir apparent existed, the king must do everything he could to beget another, and even if this meant taking a concubine, should the current queen be past childbearing years. And if this were not possible, Percy believed the king had been so enamored of his sister that he would never even look at another woman, then the next in line of the royal family by blood or marriage should take the throne upon the king's death. Oh, how Percy had ogled those words. Royal family by blood or marriage. Should Larry fail the test of kings, Percy would eventually inherit the kingdom. From that day on, Percy did all he could to make sure Larry was a self-centered, lazy lout, who would as soon as send an innocent man to the gallows as dirty his hands with honest work. Unhitching the horses from the carriage, Elfane took a moment to sigh and stretch the kinks out of his back. Oh, damn all royalty, he thought. He'd spent the night sleeping fitfully in a strange kitchen just to be there when Prince Larry had to run. He picked up the brushes and started to groom the team from the prince's coach. There had to be a way out of this job. There just had to be. Madeline spent little time kicking through the remains of her stall in the market square. The structure was cheap and expendable. In any case, it was only a side venture for her main operation, the feathered pig. She could have it rebuilt by noon tomorrow for no more cost than a few pints and a couple of winks to the right carpenters that were sure to show up at the tavern that very night. What puzzled her was the feeling that great change was coming to her life. She'd always known it would, but she didn't expect change to come this way. She shrugged and went back into the tavern. Whatever was coming, she vowed to make the most of it. A cackling laugh echoed down the dungeon's depths as the guard on the night shift arrived. He stopped dead in his tracks and sighed, straightened his tunic. She's here again, is she? It's not Beggar's Eve already, is it? Dugan asked the man on duty. Yes, she's here again, and yes, it's already Beggar's Eve. The holidays are coming sooner every year, seems like. It'll be solstice before you know it. Again, the harsh laughter came to them from several angles set in the stone. I really wish she'd quit that, said Dugan. He knew in his heart it was going to be a long night. Beggar's Eve always was. First, there had been the riot in the market, and he had even had trouble on his way to work. He'd arrived with a perpetrator under his arm and a bloody shin. Oh, how he hated the holidays. Beggar's Day came about in the Kingdom of Galaway almost 200 years before the present king. Old King Fred, and he was old, had been riding through the streets greeting his people after a hunting trip. Fred, in his later years, seemed to be able to hear only the brass blast of a hunting horn. All subtle conversation, and some shouted, was lost to him because of his near deafness. He waved as he rode, and he realized that the people were trying to tell him something. They seemed most agitated and anxious to have him hear them. He leaned down at one point just as a blacksmith leapt up to tell him that his saddle girth was undone. The resulting shift in balance made his saddle slide sideways, and to everybody's dismay, King Fred, saddle and all, slipped from his horse and fell onto the blacksmith. The blacksmith, who had been shoeing a horse, had stuck a sharp hoof knife into his shirt pocket, and when the king fell on him, the knife had sliced off the royal ear. The ear landed in the blacksmith's hand, and the king fell into the dust. Now, many a monarch would have had that blacksmith roasted slowly over his own forge, but not good King Fred. He took the whole incident as a lesson. He had the wandering ear placed in a jar of clear vinegar to preserve it. He went even further and established one day a year when everyone in the kingdom could beg the king's ear and ask a favor of his monarch. All in all, the whole idea would have been a real vote-getter had there been any votes to be gotten. The king's hall was filled with memorabilia of all the kings of Galaway. Well, not all the kings, and not all the artifacts. Some of the artifacts were lost. The lost artifact, for example, and the shield of many uses. Good King Willy slowly rotated the jar in his hand and watched Fred's ear floating within counter the centrifugal force. What would his contribution be? Sire, the first prince to fail the test of kings? He slammed the jar down on the mantelpiece so hard that he scared himself. Willy took a deep breath, and he looked around. His kingly training took him deep inside himself. There is a time for everything, he thought. But a time for failure? No. There must be a way. John came in with a tray. The king spied a jug of beer, sweetmeats, bread, and cheese. There were 2 mugs on the tray. John poured both mugs to the brim, helped himself to some meat and cheese. Cheese. There's cheese in the story. And retired his buttocks to the fire and gestured that the king should help himself. John watched the king eat and drink, and then he ventured. "It's a fine hall you've got here." "Yes," was the reply from the king. "That's all." John helped himself to more meat and cheese. And you should look here for your answers," said John, returning to the tray for some bread. The king looked at his hall. It was filled with the accomplishments of generations of his family, a family that had ruled this prosperous and mostly free country for hundreds of years. Fred's ear, Queen Dindy's telescope, the poems of King Max. All I see is defeat. The name of King Willy will live in infamy. I will have produced the only son to fail the test of kings. Sometimes, sire, what you don't see is more important than what you do see. The king was rhythmically thumping the jar containing Fred's ear against the mantelpiece. John automatically took the jar from him. The king stared intensely about him. Suddenly he pointed at an empty pedestal. "Like that?" "Yes," said John. The pedestal had been used to support the lost artifact. "And this?" The king slapped the wall beneath the plaque proclaiming the shield of many uses, which had been lost with the artifact 25 years ago. "Yes." John gave the jar with Fred's ear in it back to Willy. "And this." "Do you really think there's a way to pull it all together?" "I will. You're a better king than you give yourself credit for." At that instant, Prince Larry and Percy arrived. John had given Willy the glimmering of an idea. The idea needed careful thought and nurturing. Larry managed to drive the thought completely from Willy's head as soon as he opened his mouth. "Father, I've been thinking," Larry began, but was cut off by a powerful snort from John, who pretended to be choking on a piece of meat. John doubted very seriously if Larry had been thinking. More than likely it had been Percy who had been thinking. And from the icy glare on the royal brother-in-law directed at him, he knew he was not wrong. John held up his hands to show that he was all right. Obviously, Larry and Percy didn't know how upset the king was over the situation, or rather, perhaps Percy did, and he was leading Larry by the nose again. So have I been thinking, my son. So have I. Well, in any case, I think I found grounds to end once and for all this stupid and archaic test of kings. Oh. Have you? Oh. Yeah, Shannon, can you give MJ a hand? Yes, Father, you see, there is a law, is there not, that prohibits any free person in Galaway from being made a slave. The only slaves allowed within our borders are those brought in from another country, and if that slave owner wants to settle here, he must free his slaves. we've had that law for centuries. I don't see how it applies to the test of kings. Persons born of royalty are not free persons. They are persons born of obligation. But, Dad! John thought Larry would get farther with his father if he could keep the whining note out of his voice, but Larry didn't seem to notice the effect it had on the king. But, Dad, don't you see? If I'm unwilling to perform it, this year-in-a-day business constitutes slavery. All this nonsense of seeing how peasants live, I mean, really. I can see how the peasants live perfectly well from the window of my coach. There's absolutely no reason for me to wallow in the... Speaking of coaches and wallowing, the king cut off his son's tirade. Where were you last night, and why did you come thundering into the courtyard like that? Elfane only drives that way when he's under orders. What? Just an all-night game of dice, Dad. And the team was spooked just outside the gates. Elfane really isn't a very good driver. I don't know why I can't pick my own servants. But to get back to this silly test, is that true, Elfane? The king asked Larry's servant, who had quietly slipped into the hall. Elfane went down on one knee in front of the king. Elfane was John's son, which was why he was saddled with being Larry's servant. The king could trust him. No, sire. Where was he? He was visiting the estate of Earl Carey. Hey, Dagmar. More likely visiting the bed of the Countess. Elfane didn't reply. And were the horses spooked outside the gate? No, sire. I was instructed to make haste. Larry would have kicked him if Willy hadn't been present. I don't see what this has to do with the matter at hand. We were discussing this damn test of kings. And how it is not only against the laws of our fine country, but how it couldn't possibly apply to me. Now, if you'll just let me explain. Silence! The king roared. His roar echoed through the hall and froze all in their places. Beneath the exterior of the monarch lay the heart of a simple chicken farmer, and beneath that lay an honest man with no stomach for hypocrisy, especially in his own son. We have a lot of laws in this fine country, as you say, one of which forbids sleeping with a married woman unless you happen to be the man she's married to. You seem to think that many laws do not pertain to you. You are wrong. You disgust me, my son. You shame me here in our hall that is meant to display our honors. In the entire history of our line, never has there been such a scourge on our name that could compare with the likes of you. Oh, come off it, Dad. It's the 5th century after all. I'm a grown man and I can... Hold your tongue! Again, the king's voice stifled all. You are grown, but there's no doubt about it. There's no doubt about it if half the stories of your midnight dalliances are to be believed, but as far as being a man is concerned, you have much to learn, and you will begin with humility. As of now, a few hours before the deadline, you are stripped of all rights as my son, the prince. You will spend the night outside the door to this hall on your knees and be the first in line to beg the king's ear in the morning. What? No way! I've got a date, Dad! You can't do this to me! Oh, I can't, can I? Guards! Well-trained and obedient, and kind of liking this. The guard stepped forward instantly. Take this peasant outside. Stay with him all night, and make sure he does as instructed. There was a crash of a salute, and Prince Larry... now just plain Larry, was carried out between 2 meaty soldiers, his mouth gaping around unspoken words. John thought he noticed a smile flicker over Percy's face. John hadn't believed from the first that Larry had come up with that slavery dodge all by himself. What was really going on here? John was trying to piece it together when another guard entered and saluted. Yes? The king's intensity had not faded. The guard took a deep breath, cleared his throat, and said, We apprehended a peasant, sire. What? On what grounds? Willy didn't understand why he was being bothered with this. Stealing the royal chickens, sire. The guard would have liked to have crawled under a rock because he knew what the king was going to ask next. Did you get my chickens back? All but one, sire. And here the king's eyes grew deadly. Which one? Charlie is missing. Missing? Have you searched? He couldn't have gone far. There was evidence, sire, of... Evidence of what? Plucking, my lord. Plucking? Out! All of you out! Leave me! The king spent the night pacing the king's hall, and if he wept, who is to say if he wept for his son or for his rooster? Far below, under the castle in the dungeon, Brishee was being taken to a cell. Oh, did we get MJ's sound working yet? Just sort of checking it. Not yet. Okay, thanks. Just sort of checking. Far below, under the castle in the dungeon, Brishee was being taken to a cell. Although she put up a resistance, she was in some ways pleased. The dungeon was clean, well lit and warm. The guards had taken nothing from her, not even her tin cup. The damn cup had gotten her into this. She sat on the straw and looked about her. She seemed to be the only prisoner in the place. It was better lodging than she was used to, and she made herself comfortable in preparation for sleep. She had just laid her head on her folded, ratty robe when she heard a strange animal sound. The straw began to move. Brishee leaped back against the bars of the door and drew a deep breath to make ready to scream. The noise continued as Cruith sat up from the straw.
Excuse me, I seem to have some straw caught in my throat.
The strange old woman continued to hack and hawk until she spit into the corner, and then she settled down.
There. That's better. Oh, what's wrong with you, dearie? You thought maybe you'd get a private room?
And then the hag laughed and cackled wildly at her own joke. From down the hall, a guard yelled, "Quiet in there!"
Quiet? Quiet in here? Quiet out there, or
I'll put a curse on you that'll shrink your manhood to the size of a pea pod. Well, of course, for you it might be an improvement. And again she let go with that cackling laugh, hacked and spit, and then addressed herself to Brishee.
My name's Cruith. I got caught stealing chickens. Who are you, and what did you do to give, and what did you do, and give me one reason why I shouldn't lance you like a boil?
Well, with the last question, Cruith advanced on Brishee, her right hand extended, her dirty claws looking as if they could do the job. My name's Brishee, and I'm an escaped slave. Cruith's nails flew up to within a penny's reach of Brishee's eyes.
Don't give me that. They don't throw you in here for escaping a master, not in Galaway. They'll give you aid. They'll set you up in a job if you can escape. That's part of what's ruining this country. Now, the truth, slut, or I'll have your orbs to play knuckles with.
Brishee didn't know how to play knuckles, and she didn't want to find out. Well, not that way. I really have escaped. They brought me in for begging without a license. The tin cup had presented her with the idea of begging. She was ignorant of the fact that all beggars had to be licensed.
Well, no more of your lies. The penalty for begging without a license is not the dungeon. I'll pinch your nose till it bleeds.
Cruith grabbed Brishee's nose and began to twist.
I get adored. You what? Speak plain, girl. My nose! My nose! Let go of my nose!
Cruith released Brishee's nose to hovered close by, waiting for her answer. I kicked the guard.
A little thing like you? I don't believe it.
He's just down the hall. Ask him.
Old Dugan? Really?
The old woman called down the hall in a very sweet and sexy voice that you'd not think her capable of. Dugan, oh Dugan, could you come here for a moment, sweet cakes? Dugan came reluctantly down the hall and stood well away from the cell door. He had guarded Cruith before. What do you want, you detestable old bag? Why, I want you to tuck me in and kiss me good night, you fine stallion, you. But I see you're hurt. How did a great big Dugan get such a bad, bad boo-boo on his little shins? Oh, that she-devil in there with you kicked me for no reason. Now settle down, will you? There's no need for all this noise. You're right, you panty away. So shut your yap and go back to sleep, and don't forget, I'm begging the king's ear tomorrow. You know well as I that anyone in the dungeon has the first chance at the king's ear. Now quiet down. I've got the duty in the king's hall first thing in the morning. Nighty-night. I'll see you in your dreams, you bulging bull of a man, you. Dugan shuddered and walked away, accompanied by Cruith's lecherous laughter.
So, your story could be true. Only a stranger would beg on the streets without a license. Don't worry. He'll be out by this time next year.
Next year? Next year? Wailed Brishee for one kick.
Well, our good King Willy takes a dark view of roughing up his guards. Maybe I'll come visit you.
But won't you be in here too? I mean, you were caught stealing.
But tomorrow I'll have my amnesty. I'll bang the king's ear and be out. I do it every year.
What is this business with the king's ear? I've never heard of such a thing.
Well, on Beggar's Day, anyone can ask a favor of the king.
Well, then I might get off too.
Could be. Depends on how Maddie gets at me for stealing his chickens. Tell you what, I'll let you go first. That way you won't catch the wrath he'll feel for me.
Will he really be that upset about his chickens?
Oh, my dearie-o, you have no idea. I've been needling the old goat for years, and his chickens are very special to him. Do you want a piece?
A piece of what?
A piece of one of his chickens, of course.
Brishee had not eaten except for some goat's milk that morning, and the thought of chicken made her salivate. She eyed Cruith carefully and sneaked a peek down the hall to make sure no one had heard them. Yes, please. I'd like a piece. Cruith's eyes brightened, and reaching into her pocket, she said,
Well, here you go!
When she held out Charlie's head, Brishee screamed despite herself. Cruith began to cackle again. And a steady stream of curses erupted from Dugan. Cruith finally got herself under control, wiped the tears from her eyes, and sat down in the straw. She fished in the folds of her dress and came up with the rest of Charlie.
Come, she said. It's only roast chicken.
She deftly severed a leg and held it out for the girl.
My, you're a skittish thing. Come, sit with old Cruith, and I'll give you some pointers on dealing with that old cock King Willy.
And so it came to pass that the occupants of the dungeon spent a more restful night than the king of the realm. For that matter, they slept better than almost anyone in the castle. Oh, and MJ is on Phoenix 1.6.1.161, by the way. So he's on a one-based Phoenix viewer. Brishee and Cruith were certainly more comfortable than Larry, just plain Larry, subject to his monarch's orders, knelt outside the king's hall on the bare flagstones. For the first time in Larry's life, something was serious. His father had, at least since his mother died, always let him have his own way. There was never a time when Larry could not wheedle or make a deal with the king, but now Larry entertained the thought that perhaps his father would just make him kneel here for the night, and in the morning all would be forgiven. This notion cheered Larry for a while until he remembered the test of kings, and the strange light in the king's eyes. The power in the king's voice and the anger in him when he had taken Larry's status away. Until the king relented and said otherwise, Larry was simply Larry, and not a prince. And only the king could reinstate him. Oh, Larry groaned. It seemed his knees would crack. "Lean against the wall, if it helps," said one of the guards, "but look sharp if the king opens the door." John tossed and turned. He had never been able to rest well if the king was upset. The 2 years of mourning after Queen Wanda died were almost as hard on John as they were on the king. He gave up and heaved back his heavy quilts. Finding his robe and slippers, he lit a candle from the brazier beside his bed and went to look for his son. Elfane was in the library doing what he always did when he couldn't sleep, reading from the history of the realm. It was a huge tome chained in a cold little alcove. Elfane would sometimes study it all night. He never knew exactly what he was looking for, but he would always find something that fascinated him enough to take his mind off his troubles. "You did the right thing today," said John behind him. Elfane did not start. He was used to his father finding him here. "It didn't feel right. I don't like being used to tattle." "Is it tattling if you tell a father that you saw his toddler playing on the thin ice of a mill pond?" Larry is not a toddler, and he wasn't in danger. Larry acts like a toddler, and what he does creates danger for the realm as well as for himself. What if the Earl had caught him there? What if the Earl had killed or hurt him? What would happen to Willy and his kingdom? "You did the right thing, son." "I dislike being Larry's keeper." "Well, now that's all changed, hasn't it?" Larry sat beside his son on the cold stone bench. "Why? What do you mean?" "Larry is no longer a prince." "Well, at least not for a year and a day." "Oh, that. Well, the king will renege in the morning, and Larry will be back in bed with somebody's wife by nightfall." "Oh, you're wrong, Elfane. I know Willy better than any living soul. The boy will prove himself fair and to the letter of the law, or he'll be banished. In the meantime, you best get some rest. I have a feeling that whatever befalls Larry, you'll be a part of it." "You mean I'll be sent along as Larry's keeper?" Elfane's voice was resigned. It was a statement, not a question. "I think your status is about to change from keeper to judge." "Well, what do you know? Has the king told you what he's going to do?" "I know no more than you, and I've not seen the king since you have. However, I do know Willy, and there was thunder behind his eyes last night. There's a storm coming, and when the lightning strikes in high places, those of us on low ground should take care not to be caught unprepared." "I'm sorry, Dad, you lost me there. What are you saying?" "I'm not sure what I mean, son, except get to bed and sleep fast. You'll need your wits about you tomorrow." Percy had taken up residence in the north tower of after the king ended his mourning and moved back to the castle proper. It suited him well. The servants climbed the stairs just once a week when they had to come up to clean. By unspoken agreement, they always arrived in twos and threes. There was something yucky and slimy about the north tower. Nothing you could point your finger at, but present nonetheless. It was the same feeling you get when, feeling eyes on the back of your neck, you suddenly turn around and find a black cat staring at you. Even though it's only a cat, you wonder why that cat was staring at you. Percy's green eyes were much like a cat's as he stared into the light of a brazier heating his room. He stood, still as stone, pinching his lower lip with his right hand, barely breathing. His mind was a racetrack. the same thoughts spinning in endless laps around and around. Something was going wrong. Percy knew it, but couldn't name it. The king had reacted more strongly to his little needle than he'd expected. Percy had fed the idea to Larry just that afternoon, and Larry had jumped on it. Percy hadn't realized just how desperate the prince was. All the years of slowly twisting Larry's sense of right and wrong had evidently worked. But the king's reaction... Willy's fireworks were much more than he expected. Now, as the first cracks appeared in the hatching shell of Percy's plan, he felt an unnerving chill in his bowels. Something was going wrong. But damn it, what? His thoughts took off on another thundering round between his ears. The fire in the brazier burned low, and still Percy did not move. Dugan awoke in the darkness, as he did every morning. The 2 quarts of beer he slugged down each night before sleeping were lying heavy on his bladder. The evening ritual served as both sedative and alarm clock. Making his way in the blackness to the chamber pot, Dugan barked his newly scabbed shin on the bench. Hopping, cursing, he stumbled over the chamber pot, which, of course, was never completely empty, and spilled it, then fell in the residue. Deep in his heart, Dugan knew this was not going to be a good day. The king's red-rimmed eyes watched the first pink of dawn slip over the eastern horizon of his fief. Sighing with exhaustion, he turned and sat down on the windowsill. Gradually his breathing grew faster. He sat straighter and peered intently at the wall opposite him. His shadow covered the pedestal of the lost artifact and the empty wall space where once hung the shield of many uses. Around his shadow climbed the colors of the coming dawn. To his tired eyes, fire seemed to lick his silhouette. In that one brief instant, King Willy plumbed the depths of his soul. He saw all of his success and all of his failure, and he knew his simple stay-at-home heart was the best and the worst of him. By loving the simple life of a chicken farmer, by loving his queen almost to the point of destroying himself, by loving his son so much that he could never discipline him, King Willy had failed. He'd been a good king, true. He was good to his people and an excellent steward of the land. However, would he leave a son fit to rule his people? Would he leave his mark upon the Hall of Kings? His shadow fell unto empty places. The rotation of the earth brought the sun over the horizon. A burst of warm, golden light fell squarely on the jar containing old Fred's ear. The glass sparkled brilliantly, and the ear within throbbed a dull red. King Willy stared with amazement at the embryo of an idea he'd lost when Larry began to whine the day before, and it popped back into his head. The king clapped his hands once, and instantly John entered with fresh cakes and steaming tea. Cruith sat squinting in the gray gloom of the dungeon. She had cleared the straw from a small circle on the floor. She was busy now with some newly cleaned chicken bones. Charlie's still colorful head sat at the top of the circle. After all, it was his bones getting tossed. Charlie was talking to Cruith, and she was mumbling back. "What's this? Oh, my crossed legs. Well, a dangerous and difficult journey." Again she gathered and tossed the bones. "The breast lands upside down. Somewhere there is a traitor." Cruith stopped to remove a bit of meat that had been overlooked in the dark. She tossed the bones again and looked to where Brishee was sleeping. "The unbroken wishbone straddles the wing. Well, little one, if you be virginal, you'll be part of this too. Well, least I can do is mark the traitor." Cruith's strong hand snapped a thigh bone in half, and with the bone's marrow drew on the floor a capital T, and then she spat in the center of it and rubbed it out with her skirt. Percy sat up with a start. He'd fallen asleep, his elbow propped up on the desk. He'd been leaning his head against his closed fist. The huge ring, with his last initial cast in relief on its surface, had left an impression on his forehead. Later on, during his morning toilette, Percy would notice the red T that didn't seem to be going away. Larry counted the seconds until he would be allowed to stand. For the first time he realized his father could do anything he wanted with him. Anger flared. The doddering old fool! How far would he go to make his point? Surely this night of torture would make whatever statement the king was trying to make, and he'd be allowed some leniency on this stupid test of kings. Damn the king! Larry had planned on dancing this evening. Now, after this night on the cold stones, Larry would be lucky if he could walk, much less dance. But behind his petty anger there was real fear. His father was up to something. Of that, just plain Larry was sure. Dugan cleaned himself up as best he could, and when he had breakfasted, took his prisoners to their morning meal. Up out of bed, because of good King Willy, even criminals get fed. The rhyme had been sung every morning in the dungeon for centuries. Only the name of the king changed. "Quiet!" hissed Cruith. "Can't you let her sleep a little more? I don't think that one has been curled up around a full belly in her life." "Well, aren't you all sweetness and light this morning?" Hang on. "What happened? Find a cure for your ugliness in your dreams?" asked Dugan. His day was already soured. Cruith snorted loudly as he passed her a tray of food. "Ha! You smell like a piss pot!" "You've got 15 minutes to make yourselves ready for the king. I'll be right back." "What? Gotta run home and change your skippies? Big, bad Dugan have himself a little accident?" Dugan stomped away to change into his second-best doublet and hose. Cruith took the tray and knelt beside Brishee. Not since her parents had died had Brishee been awakened by a gentle hand and the smell of food. Many fortunes would change before long. Elfane hugged the huge volume to his chest as he climbed the staircase to the king's hall. His knuckles still bled from where he'd pried the ring from the wall. This was the first time the history of the realm had been outside the library in 100 years, and it was up to Elfane to lug it up the stairs. Of course, he hadn't listened to his father, and he'd stayed up all night. So exhausted and confused, Elfane climbed the staircase. We're going to go a few minutes over to come to a good stopping place, because you want to know what happens, don't you? And it'll be worth it. So we have to find out. There's a great place to stop. So, and it's not here. Dugan escorted his prisoner to the door of the king's hall. The grapevine had already reported to him what had transpired between the prince and the king. He carefully avoided looking at the slumped, grumbling Larry. Dugan left his prisoners with the two huge guards and entered the king's hall. It was going to be a long day on his feet, listening to petty favors being asked of the king. Dugan, like the rest of the subjects, wondered what the king was going to do with Larry. Dugan was a bachelor and would have gladly taken a case of shingles rather than a son like Larry. There we go. And so might King Willy, he suspected. As Dugan entered the room, John was clearing away the breakfast items, and Elfane was struggling to set up the huge history of the realm by the light from the windows. Dugan immediately went to help him. "What gives, Elfane?" Dugan asked under his breath as he helped Elfane lift the huge book. "I don't know. I was told to bring this mammoth up here and be ready to look up facts for the king. How goes the pool?" Dugan pointedly cleared his throat and looked back over his shoulder at the king. Willy was whispering to John. Dugan supplemented his income by running gambling pools on various castle affairs. Prince Larry's year and a day of service had turned into a record event. Well, without whipping out my abacus, I'd guess most of the money is on the king getting off easy. Towel boy at the royal spa or some such. Although, since last night, a lot of money has gone to the other side. Them that thinks Willy will put him to work on a chicken farm. Well, right now, I'd say it's almost 50-50. "And if it's neither?" asked Elfane. Well, then you can take your payoff or let the sum ride on the next pool, which is whether or not Larry will make it. There's already heavy betting that he won't. Put me down for 3 silvers on him not making it. Don't want to bet on what his service will be? Not with the king and my father looking so smug. Well, now that you mention it, I may have trouble covering the winners, no matter how it turns out. Dugan and Elfane finished arranging the book and separated, both of them helping to prepare the hall for Beggar's Day. Percy was running a little late. The tea on his forehead had refused to go away, no matter what kind of exotic oils he rubbed into it. He wanted to get to the hall before things began. As he came out of the north tower into the courtyard, he tripped over a chicken. Percy fell, covering himself with dust, and the old hen he'd fallen over ran a few paces and turned to scold him. All the way across the courtyard, chickens ran in front of him like cats wanting to be fed. They tangled themselves in Percy's steps. He would have gladly booted them out of the way, except booting Willy's chickens was not a politic thing to do. By the time he reached the door across the way, he was red and flustered, and more than one servant chuckled behind the shutter. Crazy chickens! Percy decided that when he became king, he would celebrate with a fine dinner of roast chicken, and poultry would be forever banned from the castle keep. Percy pushed his way to the front of the line just as John opened the door to the hall. Percy took one of the spots reserved for the nobles in the gallery. He frowned when he recognized the history of the realm on the table. What was Willy up to? Behind the other door, the beggars lined up with Cruith and Brishee. They were a rowdy and excited mob. None of them looked at Larry or talked to him. The tension was relieved periodically by Cruith, who was given to pinching the butts of the 2 guards. The guards were at attention and not supposed to move. This, of course, made it more fun for Cruith and her audience. Do we have to put up with this hag? One asked the other out of the side of his mouth. I think it's almost, damn it. Almost time to begin. Ow, damn! I felt shorter claws when I've been mauled by a lion. I did say it. You've never been mauled by lions? No, not yet, but if I lose my temper and kill one of the king's beggars, it may yet happen. Well, at least we could fight back. Ouch! Ow, one more time, you old bundle of rags, and I'll knock your teeth out. Oh, such a big, brave man. I've got news for you, for Goliath. I haven't got any teeth! The howling laughter from the crowd was cut off by the opening door to the hall, and John winked at Cruith. Send in the peasant Larry, he intoned in his best official voice. The guards helped Larry to stand, and when it became obvious he couldn't walk, one of them helped him into the hall. At this point, even Cruith was subdued. The door remained open just enough for the beggars to hear a gasp from the gallery, and then it swung shut. The thick oak prevented the beggars from hearing what went on in the hall. The king stood up from his throne, and silence swept the hall. He stood and waited. And finally, the guard realized what he was waiting for and gently helped Larry to kneel before his king. Willy looked over his son's head to his people. He glanced to his right to make sure Elfane was at his post by the history, and then he looked to his left at John, who gave a quiet nod. My good people, it is indeed an important day for our country. Not only is it Beggar's Day, when anyone may ask a favor of us, but by marvelous circumstance it is also the 21st birthday of my son Larry. There was more than one furrowed brow over this statement. No one could imagine why Willy should be happy over this. Willy paused, enjoying the confusion that he saw on the faces before him. As you know, all kings of Galaway must spend a year and a day at some honest work, as has been so for centuries, and if I have my way, will be so for centuries to come. And as some of you may know, my son is the laziest lout to be born into the royal family within living memory. There was another gasp at this, but Willy pretended not to notice. Many who had placed bets with Dugan on the royal spa wished that they could change their bets at this point. The king went on. If I thought it would do him any good, I'd have your prince spend his year and a day shoveling a manure pile the size of Mount Mayo, but I want him to learn humility and gain wisdom, not come back from his labors resentful and angry. Dugan was glad the betting was closed. At this point, everybody would either want out or to change bets. He wished the king would get on with it. Dugan figured that after today he could either retire or lose his shirt. The suspense was doing nasty things to his stomach. There's no crying in baseball. There have been other things on my mind, however. An involuntary groan escaped from Dugan. The soldier beside him cut him off with a surreptitious elbow to the ribs. I've been thinking about the history of our country, continued the king, and how we have lost many of our artifacts, and how the mystery of my brother, Prince Monaghan, remains unsolved. Just how all this ties in with my son and Beggar's Day will shortly be revealed, for now, hear the first part of my decree. My son, the shiftless and spoiled Prince Larry, will spend his first year and a day of service as personal servant to the first person to beg the king's ear. At this, he held up the jar with Fred's ear floating in it. What? Damn it, Dad! I've had just about enough of this. You can't make me serve some rotten peasant. Guards, gag that man! A stunned second passed before Dugan and company jumped to respond. They did their best not to smile as they performed their task. A job, in their opinion, that was overdue for years. I realize, said Willy, that there have been some speculation as to what job my son would be given. Here he looked pointedly at Dugan, who was so shocked he almost looked innocent. But serving as servant is only part of the formula I have in mind. Bring in the first beggar. Dugan opened the door and bid Brishee to enter. He led her to kneel beside Larry. One from the dungeon, my lord, he intoned ritualistically. It was the rule that a prisoner who could beg his or her amnesty before his crime was announced. I beg to be pardoned for my crimes, lord. Brishee's voice was clear and carried through the hall. The king seated himself and rubbed his chin. This was one of the most difficult parts of Beggar's Day. It was up to him to guess how serious the crime was before he decided if he should pardon it or not. Willy was actually fairly good at it. He'd never pardoned a murderer or failed to free a petty thief. He looked at the young woman before him and panicked slightly. A beautiful maiden was not what he had in mind for his son's master. Oh, well, he had spoken, and if the point of this exercise was to teach Larry the value of the king's word, he must live up to his part of it. Very well. You are pardoned, with conditions. What were her crimes? Dugan read from his list. Having arrived here as a slave, she escaped her master, then proceeded to beg without a license, and when I arrested her for said offense, she boldly kicked my shins. Sire. This brought a round of chuckles from all. Dugan made a face. The king considered. This was better than he'd expected. As all citizens know, we encourage ex-slaves in this land with jobs and opportunities. Had you known that, perhaps you wouldn't have resorted to these minor crimes. I choose to employ you myself. You are to follow the trail of my brother, Monaghan, in quest of the lost artifact and the shield of many uses. I will give you full support to your mission, including this peasant beside you as your own servant. For this work, you will be paid 300 gold pieces, half now and half when you return. The servant's pay is not to exceed 1 silver a week. Will you take the job? Brishee fought hard to think clearly. Things certainly happened fast around here. Some of the poison aplomb bred into her by her parents came to the surface. I accept your employment, sire, but I, too, have conditions. If Willy was shocked, he didn't show it. And these conditions are, I would ask that you employ the one that follows me through the beggar's door in the same quest, that you also pardon her for her crimes, and that I know more about these things that you send me to seek. Very well. I grant your favors, provided the beggar you speak of is not guilty of a crime of violence. Elfane, find the history and the story of Prince Monaghan and prepare to read. Dugan, bring in the next beggar. Dugan dutifully led in Cruith. The king scowled, and Cruith beamed. As they reached the throne, she lifted the back of Dugan's doublet so that the observers in the gallery could see the holes in his second-best hose. Feeling a draft, Dugan swatted Cruith's hand and said, "One from the dungeon, sire." "Hello, Cruith. I trust you're not here for a crime of violence." Cruith batted her rheumy eyes.
"Oh, never. Not me, good King Willy."
"Don't push it, Cruith. Dugan, what was her crime?" "Theft, sire." The rules of occasion didn't require him to tell what she had stolen. "You are pardoned, with conditions."
"Oh, thank you, sire. I'm very grateful, and I assure you, Charlie is in a safe place and still doing his duty to you and your subjects,"
said Cruith, rubbing her stomach. The pantomime was not lost on the king. A bigger hush than before fell over the hall. Even the flies stopped buzzing. The only thing happening was the color of Willy's face changing from rosy pink to enraged purple. It was a moment before the king could speak. You stole Charlie?" Cruith did her best to look repentant.
"Aye, sir. 'Twas me."
"Where is he?"
"I've taken him in, so to speak."
You didn't. You didn't!" Cruith answered with a belch. Willy's knuckles cracked with the strain of his grip on the arm of his throne. Gradually, he controlled his breathing, and his face went from purple to white. "Very well. These are my conditions for your pardon. You will accompany this young woman on the quest I have laid on her. You will be in my employ and subject to my orders." Here Willy paused, and his voice trembled as he went on. "And if ever we see you before us on Beggar's Day again, or if ever you are caught around our chickens again, you will spend the rest of your natural life polishing the floor of the royal coop. Is that understood?"
"Sure, Willy."
"And damn it, we are not back on the chicken farm, Cruith. You will never again address me by my first name." Signaling for Mead, the king sat back and croaked, "Read, Elfane, read!" Elfane swallowed and began to read, the timbre of his voice a bit thin at first, and then filling in as he became absorbed in the material.
And that's where we're going to stop.
And we'll pick up next week finding out what Elfane reads from the history of the realm as Brishee begins the quest to find Prince Monaghan and all the stuff. Did MJ ever get his sound fixed? Oh, I hope you got to hear some of that. Oh, it's a wonderful story, and it is such a hoot to read. I have to tell you, it's just a delight. So anyway, we'll pick up next week. We're going to do 4 more weeks of this. The book is a delight, and as I said at the beginning, it's available on. Hang on, I need to change my screen here. It's available online if you want to read all the joys of it. Oh yeah, I know, poor Charlie. Well, you got to have something here.